Hello, everyone. Welcome today to our webinar. We are going to have a presentation on pasture to policy. The conversation is confronting the rise of livestock infestation and protecting the food supply. We are very lucky today to have Senator Casey Murdock of Oklahoma. Senator Murdock brings both legislative experience and firsthand knowledge of rural communities and of agricultural and issues that we're experiencing today. We're just very pleased, and this is going to be a great session to learn as much as we can. Thank you, Senator Murdock.
Thank you. And thank you, CSG, for hosting this. This is a very important topic. Agriculture, I think, is the most important industry we have in our country because we are not only feeding the country, we're feeding the world. And we are having some hurdles that's being thrown at us right now, some that we have not seen in 40 years. And when I was thinking about how I wanted to go about this, pasture to policy, I think we need to understand where we're at uh, as an industry, where we're at as a country, and the best way to figure out where we're at is where have we been and what got us to where we're at. And um, that's kind of how I want to start. I'm gonna kind of what I'm going to go over is the livestock industry in the U.S. as it is, and then why animal health matters, and then the economic impacts of an infestation or a disease outbreak, and what we can do as policymakers. So we have in the United States, we have 518 million chickens, we have 86 million head of cattle, and 74 million hogs. And we are very, very lucky as a country. We can walk into a grocery store and we have an abundant amount of food, whatever we want. Walk in and there is aisles and aisles of food. But I think what woke us up and made every American start thinking about food security was COVID. And if you remember during COVID, uh, the meat coolers in grocery stores was shy of meat or uh, no meat at all. Um, that was because of a supply chain interruption. It wasn't because we were short on cattle. There were plenty of cattle, there were plenty of chickens, there were plenty of hogs, but it was the supply chain from the processor to the grocery store that got interrupted. And we saw what happened. And when we have a little chink in the supply chain, so why does this matter? We've heard for the past year from our president all the way down to a regular person in New York City or LA about beef prices. Beef prices are too high. Well, right now, today, we are at 74-year lows. We have the lowest inventory of cattle since 1951. And why is that? It is because of drought. We have had droughts hit every part of the United States in the last 15 years. Uh, and I think we're going through our second round of droughts right now in the section of the country that have probably uh, the largest number of the cow-calf units in America. Uh, we saw producers reduce number of cattle they're running or just get out of business altogether because prices are so high. And, you know, the average age of a rancher in the United States is around 65 years old. They may be thinking it's time to retire, but the entry fee to get into the business is so high, we don't have people replacing them. The other reason we have declining numbers is urban sprawl. I'm going to use Oklahoma City as an example. Oklahoma City is one of the fastest growing cities in the country. So I've been at the Capitol for 12 years now. And in these 12 years, I have seen the growth. I've seen housing developments pop up, go up, and they're building these housing developments where at one time cattle herds grazed. But there will never again be any cattle grazed on that property. And it's not just cattle grazing. It's in California. I've got a place out there, and I love strawberries. I can I can I can make myself sick eating strawberries, and I would go down and you could buy them from the farmer. They'd have a little stand set up, and I would buy flats and flats of strawberries and eat them till I was sick. That farm is now the headquarters to Toyota in Southern California. It is cement. And we are losing ag acres, but we are gaining population of people that agriculture needs to feed. So how do we handle that as an industry? How do we handle that as policymakers? Well, it's management practices. And we have the main proteins that we have in the United States is poultry, swine, and cattle. And I've talked about how we've had diminishing numbers and the health threats that each one of these face. So in poultry, here a few years ago, we had the bird flu, the avian flu. We saw egg prices go up because of the bird flu got in. Why the bird flu is so scary is because we have migratory birds that can spread it. The only, I say good thing, it is seasonal. It is more prevalent in the winter months, and we can manage it a little better. The other thing is with poultry and swine, and I'm going to get to swine in just a second. Everything to do with those industries is very, very controlled. They control what goes into a barn and what comes out of a barn on a daily basis. Same with swine. One of the things swine is facing is the African swine fever. Now, the closest the swine fever has gotten to the United States was Haiti. And in 2019, 2020, Haiti had a case of the African swine fever. So in Oklahoma, we have about 2.5 million hogs, and most of them are in my district. That raised our eyebrows. That got us nervous. But it did not make it on up here. But it did. It's mainly in Africa and Europe and Asia is where the African swine fever is. But it did get close to the United States. For cattle, we have the New World screwworm and the Asian longhorn tick. I kind of got ahead on the slide, so I talked about poultry. And, for CSG South, for the southern United States, chickens are a large part of our economy. So with African swine fever, it is 100% mortality rate for infected pigs. When we were worried about this, we met with our Secretary of Ag. What it was going to cost the state, what it was going to cost the Department of Ag of the state of Oklahoma, if this hit, was close to $10 million just to deal with it. So the major cost is, what do you do with the carcasses? You have a infected pig that died with African swine fever. What do we do with carcasses? The cost of dealing with the carcasses was going to be $10 million for the state of Oklahoma. That is what me as a policymaker was looking at. With cattle, the Asian longhorn tick, that is about a 50% mortality rate if it gets into cattle. It spreads theileriosis. Now, this right here tells you why I'm a state senator and not a veterinarian, is I have a problem pronouncing all these diseases, so bear with me on this. But it spreads theileriosis. The scary thing about this is wildlife can serve as host reservoirs. And you cannot really control it with a movement restriction or a quarantine because it is already in our deer herds. It is already in our wildlife. And so it's hard to control. Europe has a treatment for it, but their treatment, we have a different strain here in the United States, and that treatment does not work here in the United States. I had a meeting with our Secretary of Ag, our state vet, and USDA a few months ago on this, and USDA was pretty tight-lipped whenever I started saying, "Hey, we need to start looking for treatments here in the United States. What can we do to get our universities to start doing research?" And why I say they're tight-lipped, I think it's happening. They just couldn't tell me that it was happening or what company was researching the treatment because of trade secrets. But we are working on this. But this is hit Felt, Oklahoma. My nephew has had this hit his herd, and he has lost a tremendous amount of cattle because of the Asian longhorn tick. But we are working on a treatment for it. Now, the prom king of infestations. And why I say this has made all the news. Everybody knows about this. We have watched its march from Central America up through Mexico. And we had the first case, actually 7 cases, on June the 4th in South Texas. I do want to applaud Secretary Rawlins for her quick actions on this. She shut the border down, and I believe that slowed it coming to the United States, but then she upped the production of the sterile flies. And so what this little pest does is it lays its eggs in wounds and umbilical cords, in the eye sockets of animals. And when the eggs hatch, its larvae starts burrowing into flesh. It will cause loss of production. It will cause death. If there is a good thing about the screwworm is, a lot of these other diseases, there's unknowns. We don't know how it's going to affect the economy. We don't know, how to treat it. We don't know how to deal with it. But with the screwworm, it was here before. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was all across America. It was causing lots of damage, lots of economic damage, and we were able to get rid of it with the sterile fly. We know how to get rid of it. We know how it's treating it, how to treat it, and we, as policymakers, we know the economic impact, the hit to our economy because of it, and so we know when we allocate money for these programs to do away with it, that we are not just throwing our money away. We know how to get rid of it, and we know our money's being spent properly. So back to the food supply. With having fewer numbers of cattle and more people eating beef today than we ever have. Our producers in this country are great at what they do. We can have the best genetics, meeting the need of the consumer, meeting the supply needs. We can have the best nutrition, and we can have the best management practices of anyone to meet these needs. But a disease outbreak, a infestation from a screwworm, it throws all that out the window, and we can lose years of progress that we made in genetics. And back to that chink in the supply line. Disease outbreaks can quickly eliminate years of progress. So the economic impacts of disease outbreaks. Producer losses. And I'm going to start with quarantines. For example, in South Texas, where you've got that 12-mile radius that they have movement restrictions where the screwworm is. If you are a producer in that quadrant, but you're not infected, there's nothing is going on with your herd. It's costing you money. You can't ship your cattle out. Your cattle's not worth as much because nobody wants to buy them. Animal losses. So this is where I'm going to go back to the screwworm, because we know what it cost the state of Texas in 1976. In 1976, the screwworm outbreak cost the state's economy $285 to $375 million. In today's prices, that was in the billions. It is in the billions today. It cost producers $135 million just to deal with it, with treatments, with losses. In today's 2026 dollar value, it was $785 million is what it costs that industry. You have veterinary and treatment costs, the medicine. The labor cost is intensive. I visited with a rancher that grew up during this time in Texas. He said when he was a kid, his job was to get on his horse every day and ride out through the herd and doctoring wounds, doctoring if screwworms got into him. That was his job. It was very labor intensive. Why cattle is different than pigs and sheep, or pigs and poultry, excuse me. Like I said earlier, their production is highly controlled. They're in barns. They are in chicken houses, and they control everything everyone that walks into that barn and walks out on a daily basis. They control what these animals are exposed to. But with cattle, they are turned out on the range. They are turned out to deal with Mother Nature, to deal with whatever the environment is going to throw at them. So controlling a outbreak is harder with cattle than it is with poultry or pigs. So trade restrictions. Well, we saw with the BSE, mad cow, in 2003, when we got hit with that, we lost trade agreements with China and Japan. They cut off imports of U.S. cattle. That hurt our cattle market tremendously. We saw just recently what happened with the screwworm when we shut down the Mexico border. It did hurt the Mexican producers, but how it hurt our economy is we had feed yards in Texas that primarily feed out Mexican cattle. They were not getting these cattle. Their lot sat empty. What happens to that guy that works that feed yard? What happens to the guy that's feeding those cattle? What happens in the supply chain at these meat processing plants that usually get these cattle? They're not there. It's a chink in our supply chain. Food supply disruptions. So in Texas in 76, they estimate that screwworm uh, affected 1 million head of cattle, either in loss of production or the cattle wound up dying altogether. Well, think about it. You had 1 million head. That beef did not make it to the meat processor. That beef did not make it to the grocery store. And it most definitely didn't make it to your dining room table. It was gone, which supply and demand, it, it forces prices to go up. So next on the slide, it's increased consumer costs, supply chain disruptions. Well, we've had firsthand knowledge right now on gas prices. What a war in Iran, the supply chain of oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, what that did to our gas prices. It's the same thing with cattle prices. They're both traded on the board of trade, and when something happens, good or bad, it affects the prices. And if we have an outbreak, whether it's a disease or the screwworm infestation, it is going to force the prices up. It is going to force the prices up in the grocery stores. And as policymakers, I can tell you my phone rings a lot from constituents that's complaining about this or that. We as policymakers are going to catch the blunt of our food is too high. We hear our president talk about it all the time. That is why this is so important that we get this stuff right. Secondary impacts to our economy. Like I said a while ago, they had it has fingers, it has ripples throughout the ag industry when we have an outbreak. So right now, today, as I'm speaking to y'all, there are probably about 400,000 head of livestock on our highways in the United States being shipped somewhere, either to a packing house, to a feed yard, to a ranch somewhere. If we have a stop movement order because of an outbreak, it will affect trucking companies. It will affect feed suppliers. It will affect rural communities, local auction barns. So when I first graduated from college, I traded cattle. And I hit 4 or 5 sale barns a week. In every small community that have a auction market, that is the biggest time for that town's economy during the week. If we have an outbreak, and it will hurt auction markets, it will also hurt our small communities, our small towns' economies. But another thing is it reduces consumer confidence. You all saw the pictures of that screwworm. If that makes the news, and those pictures make the news, that consumer of a beef product in New York or in LA or in an urban area that sees these pictures, they're going to be wary about buying beef. They're going to be wary about it. Even though I cannot emphasize this enough, the screwworm does not affect the quality of our beef. It does not affect the safety of our beef. What it does is it affects the production. It affects the production of beef. And it is no different than in if a oil refinery explodes, blows up, it affects the production of gasoline. It doesn't affect the quality of gasoline. And same with the screwworm. Your beef that you're buying in the grocery store is totally safe from anything dealing with a screwworm. But for your uneducated consumer, a secondary impact would be they lose confidence. The cost of preparedness is almost always less than the cost of responding to a widespread outbreak. So who is responsible for animal health? So you have the USDA, federal government, state government through the Department of Ag. And, you know, on the ground, first to hit it is the state departments of Ags. And with that, it's the state veterinarian. And they deal with it through administrative rules. And if we are in session, we may have to run some legislation. But the bulk of it is, like I had said, with the African swine fever, as legislators, we got to make sure that we are funding our ag departments adequately. We have to make sure that they have enough funding for. I'm gonna click ahead on these slides. Maybe I missed it. Sorry. So funding our state Department of Agriculture, state ag department. You look at what's going on in Texas. They have premises quarantines. They have a 12-mile control zone. They have livestock inspection requirements. You have to enhance response funding. This takes people. This takes boots on the ground inspecting these animals. You've got to have people making sure that these quarantine zones are being upheld. You got to make sure staffing and inspection is funded properly. The other thing is you have to coordinate with other states. And I know when I visited with our state vet on the longhorn tick issue, he had already been visiting with states around us, their state vets, and what they're dealing with. So it's very important that we keep communications open with other states and work together, because we are all in this together. Our ag economy is nationwide, is one state working with another state. How the feds work, we have to have a great partnership with our federal delegation, with our federal partners, with USDA, because they can coordinate state to state responses and keep us working together to face an outbreak. So sometimes regulations are appropriate, but sometimes education, research, and innovation is more effective, like the longhorn tick. We've got to have a new treatment program for that disease. That's innovation. We have to research. How do we do that? That's education. That's through our universities. But I think it's also educating our producers on how to look for a problem. How do they see a symptom? I barely, and you guys see the gray in my mustache, I barely remember the screwworm in the 70s. All I can tell you is there is a treatment in our barn that I've never used, but it's sitting there just in case. We've got to educate the new producers of what to look for and how to detect it. And that is something that our state ag departments can do. We can start educating producers on response. So, in conclusion, if we're going to protect our food supply, we have to have strong state and federal partnerships. We have to have science-based decision making. We've got to have producer engagement. We've got to have disease surveillances. We have to have emergency preparedness. We have to have a plan. And with us watching the screw war march up Mexico, we knew it was going to get here. It gave us, as we watched this, gave us a year to start getting prepared. What are we going to do? How are we going to handle it? And then legislative support, because this will cost money, and we will probably have to pass statutes on and how we deal with this, and kind of some guidelines of how we're going to get through this. So with this, thank you. That is my presentation, and I think if there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Well, thank you so much. Very informative, and there's definitely so many, questions. I've got a lot of questions in my mind, just going through and listening to some of the processes and the numbers that you've quoted on different areas of when an infestation happens. One question that has popped up is, I think it's a little on the farmer side, or perhaps it's a rancher. When they do discover an infestation, what resources are available to them? What happens? Is it on the role of the farmer to contact all the different agencies, and then when that happens, is that the economic impact to the farmer of the extra inspections, the extra veterinarian care? How does that actually work when you see something like that hit a herd or a farm?
So you would contact your local vet, and then that vet would reach out to uh, the state veterinarian, and let him know what is going on. And from there, it is in the state's hands. Um, the cost to the farmer or rancher, uh, and this happened here in Oklahoma, about 10 years ago. There was a herd that was suspected to have TB. The state vet came in and started bleeding cows. The cost is the labor. He had to bring all his cows in. They had to bleed them one at a time and take blood samples to test to see whether they have TB or not. Now, with that, all the positives, he they had to euthanize. So he was out that money. But as far as moving forward, the the Department of Ag took care of the inspections and the bleeding and all of that. And back to funding, it's why we have to fund our state Department of Ags adequately so they can cover these costs.
Um, and then a second question is, when we talk about workforce, and we often hear, our farming and our ranching, folks that are out, doing the work that you guys do, especially supplying some of the beef, the chicken, the swine. Uh, but then, there's a loss of people that are, ongoing that type of profession. And then you look at the other side, where we see there's a shortage of veterinarians, there's a shortage of folks that are, out there available to do the inspection. Are there things that states are doing, especially in the ag realm, that, really trying to figure out ways to ramp up that type of workforce? And if so, what are some states or what are some things that you're seeing that have been, encouraging for the growth of the industry?
So, as far as just the workforce and the ag industry, it's a tough job. It's rewarding, and I said this a long time ago, and I've ranched all my life. I'm not in it for the money. I'm in it for the love of what I do. Um, it takes a special person because it is hard work. It is uh, dirty work. It is miserable work. When you're keving and you're having to pull a calf in a blizzard or a snowstorm and you're freezing to death, uh, sometimes you wonder about your life choices. Should have I done this? When I went to college, I wanted to be a stockbroker. There is a picture in my office uh, that has a guy on a mountain next to a horse. It's snowing, it's cold, and the name of the picture is I should have been a stockbroker. But when I saw that, I knew I had to have it because I've been there. I've been freezing to death thinking, man, I should have been a stockbroker. So with that, it's just a hard life, but it's a life that is so rewarding. The freedoms that you have. Um, I know in my area there are plenty of people that want to get into it. What the obstacles are with our younger generation getting into agriculture is the entry fee, the cost. It is very expensive. You almost have to inherit it or win the lottery to get into it. Now, FSA does have beginner farmer loans, uh, but it's not enough to get in full time. You'll have to have a part time job and work slowly. As far as veterinarians, and this is the threat to large animal production, uh, is the shortage of large animal vets, and kind of the uh, same as it's a tough life because when I have to pull that calf in a blizzard in a snowstorm, more than likely I call the vet and he's there beside me and he's freezing and he's having to pull that calf. Um, what we have seen with the veterinary industry is we have, and you go to probably every vet school in America, and you look at how many are going into small animal versus how many are going into large animal veterinary services. And it's much more going into small animal. It's a 9 to 5, pretty much a 9 to 5 job. You're not being called out in the middle of a snowstorm at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're a small animal vet. So in Oklahoma, what we have done, we have the legislator added, uh, I believe it was $20 million to a scholarship program for vet students that were going to go into large animal vet services and go to rural Oklahoma.
That's
And
great.
we reallocated that money last year, and the emails I have gotten from students thanking me for that program have been I've had several, but that is something that you can look at. I think Farm Bureau, the state Oklahoma State Farm Bureau, has has a scholarship program to incentivize kids to get into large animal vets.
Yeah, that's great. I know a lot of rural schools used to really have a promotion of the FAA, and you just don't see that as much anymore. So, there could be a shortage of just getting out the opportunities of farming and what is available and the need is there. It's an industry that is needed and it's an industry that just continues to grow. So we need folks to stay with it and to get involved. Senator, I have one more question for you and then we will let you get back to your day. Could you provide an example of a specific regulation or preparedness effort Oklahoma has implemented to prevent investment events?
Um, Not right offhand. I would have to see. I know we've been watching Texas. Now, our state vet has a plan uh, if it comes to Oklahoma. If we get a screwworm in Oklahoma, he has a plan that he has put out,
Okay.
and I believe. Let me roll back on the slides. It is similar to what Texas has done, and that is going to be um, um, the 12-mile control zone livestock inspection is what we're going to do here. And he's already got the plan written up on what we're going to do if the screwworm makes it to Oklahoma.
Well, thank you so much. This was very informative. We really appreciate you taking your time and spending, your research and all the experience that you have as a farmer and a legislator. So we do appreciate, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you at SLC in a couple of weeks.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to all the participants, and I hope everybody has a great weekend.
Yes, you too. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.